You know, we're living in very interesting days. All throughout the news for the last several decades, the Middle East is just so in just the front and center of what is happening in the world. And of course, this stirs up all kinds of conversation, both in the secular world as well as in the religious world or within the Christian world. And that's the question of Israel. You know, is God done with Israel? Does Israel still matter? And I believe that Israel very much so matters. And one of the main reasons why it matters is because God is a God of covenant. He makes a commitment and he doesn't turn back on his commitment. In fact, what is interesting is that so much of God's character, his attributes in the Bible are connected to his covenant. We know that he's faithful because he made a covenant and he's going to keep his covenant. And what is interesting is that in Acts chapter 1, Jesus is talking to his disciples. It was about the kingdom. And right before Jesus ascends, the apostles ask him a very, very interesting question. They say, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And there's two things to say about that. We can get a lot of insight into what was being taught by the question that was being asked. He was with them for 40 days. And after 40 days for them to ask that question, I think that gives us a hint that that was the subject that he was talking about. It was the restoration of God's kingdom to Israel, number one. Number two, notice Jesus' answer. He doesn't say no. He just says it's not for you to know the time. The time of what? The restoration of God's kingdom to the nation of Israel. The other thing that's interesting is in Acts chapter 28, verse 20 to 22, Paul makes a really interesting statement. He said, it is for the hope of Israel that I am in these chains. Israel matters significantly. Why? Because God made a covenant with Israel. The restoration of his kingdom has to do with a Jewish king who will rule and reign, who is the son of David, who will rule and reign in Israel. According to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 7:14, but the entire chapter, it really suggests that if you are the king of Israel, you are the king of the whole world. And so for the world to be brought into the fullness of her glory, for the world to be brought into the full glory that was purchased by the cross of Jesus Christ, it necessitates a Jewish king to rule and reign in Jerusalem, and from there rule the nations of the world. And so now we're talking about the subject of the second coming, that when Jesus comes, he comes back. And that was the question. Are you at this time going to establish, restore the kingdom to Israel? In other words, here you are, Jesus, in the resurrection. Are you now going to go into Jerusalem and set things up? He goes, no. He goes, I'm going to ascend. I'm going to fill you with power, and I'm going to send you to the nations as a witness. A witness of what? A witness of my kingdom, a witness of my gospel. What is the gospel? It is the message of the rule and the reign of Christ Jesus, who is the Jewish king, who died on the cross. He was buried, he was risen from the dead, he ascended into the very heavens, poured out his spirit, and at the fullness of the time that was determined by his Father, this Jewish king will return to the earth and set up his kingdom in Israel, and it will be most glorious. Isaiah 2 makes it very clear that the nations will flow up the mountain of the Lord, and they will come and hear the law. They will come and hear the instruction of Christ. The nations will be rebuked. The nations will be unified. There will be world peace. They will not study in war no more. The environment will be changed. I mean, many, many glorious things will happen. So yes, Israel is absolutely critical because it is the vortex of God's covenant. God made a covenant with the Jewish people, and he will not, he won't relinquish that covenant. His glory, his whole reputation, he put his whole reputation at stake by making a covenant with this people. And it's not about the people, it's about him, it's about his glory, it's about his character. And then when the nations see Israel restored in the full glory, the prophet Ezekiel says this about 60 to 63 times. He says this, then you will know that I am the Lord. He says, Israel, I'm going to do these particular things with you. And when these things happen, you will know that I am, like he told Moses in Exodus 3. Nations of the earth, when you see me do these particular things, when you see me fulfill these promises to this people, then all the nations will know that I am Yahweh, for the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord like the waters cover the sea. And so when we're looking at the news and the current events and we see Israel, that doesn't mean that Israel is right, wrong. It's not about that. God brought this people back into the land, 1948, 1967, for the purpose of bringing this thing into full climax, which is for his son to return and to establish his kingdom in Jerusalem, and so the earth to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord like the waters cover the seas.